So that's an interesting question. And actually, I started thinking about these issues when my daughters were born. I have two daughters, and when they were small and growing up, I was looking around for, interesting stories, interesting books to tell them that were anchored in an Indian, cultural setting. And it just seemed to me that whatever I found for them, whatever was available, easily available, in pop culture and easy to access books, was stories about women who seemed to me very unreal in a way of speaking. They seemed like these impossible goddesses. All sorts of, all their characteristics had been whitewashed out of them. At the same time, it was very evident that in our day-to-day lives, in India, and this is a pan-India phenomena, how every country uses foundational myths to tell each other stories about how a culture came to being, how a nation came to being, and even on a more personal level, how a family came to exist. So we tell ourselves these stories, and I realize that a lot of our stories and our myth making actually comes from our ancient texts, the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and especially where women are concerned, it was a little bit concerning, in fact, for me, that a lot of the examples that we were giving young girls, growing up, were actually from the Ramayana. A lot of examples of Sita were given to us. Things like the Lakshman Rekha are still terms which are used in general parlance today to talk about the limits beyond which, a good woman in India should not cross. We celebrate things, like Raksha Bandhan, about girls looking for protection from their brothers. So, in many subtle ways, with these cultural sort of, influences and very, very nuanced and subtle ways, we tell girls how to behave. We tell them not to laugh too loudly. Look what happened to Draupadi when she laughed too loudly. And we keep telling and reinforcing these ideas, and women are complicit in this as well. So this became an idea that I was thinking about when my girls are growing up, and I wanted to present women in Indian history and mythology as they might have been in the cultural context in which they were written about. So actually, my very first book is Song of Draupadi. Even though it's my last work to be published, I first looked at the Mahabharata as almost, an antithesis to Sita and the Ramayana, and to find all these fiery women, because there are many extraordinary women in the Mahabharata apart from Draupadi. So I wanted to bring out these lives almost as an alternative for young women to look at the ways in which Indian women have been presented in the past. That's a question that I'm asked very often, and people tend to assume, and in fact, I was told this, especially when I went on to historical nonfiction, I was told there aren't the voices of women. You won't find many texts where women are concerned, and it'll be very difficult to flesh out the stories where women are concerned. And to a certain extent, this is true. We often don't find them recorded in nearly the sort of quantum in which men are recorded. The written histories we have to accept, and this is not just an Indian phenomenon, it is really a global one. History has been written by men for men in overwhelming numbers. And, where women are concerned, the voices, even when they are written, are often tainted with prejudice and malice. And we try to, write about them in ways that are demeaning and somehow lessen their achievements. But nonetheless, evidence does exist, even though it is very, very frail sometimes and, insubstantial. So, for example, when I was writing Daughters of the Sun, I came across this book by the academic Ruby Lal, Dr. Ruby Lal, and she's written this extraordinary book called Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World. And in that, she uses a source material, a primary source, which is the autobiography of Gulbadan, Babur's daughter. And this is a work so precious and so unique in the world. It is the story of a woman who was an inhabitant of a Mughal harem, writing from within the harem. And she's telling us this story about her father, Babur, this great emperor and founder of the Mughal dynasty. And you would think such a work, would be very preciously kept and celebrated. But in fact, once it was written in the 16th century, it completely disappeared from even our collective consciousness. No other historian referred to it. Nobody talked about it. We forgot completely that it existed. It was just a very fortuitous encounter that a British agent in the 19th century happened to buy this random manuscript that he found amongst many, many thousands of manuscripts. These were taken back to England, and in the early 20th century, when they were translated from Persian to English, it was discovered that this was Gulbadan's autobiography. And it was only when Dr. Rubilal, some years ago, analyzed this and understood the significance of what this work meant, that it actually showed to us what the Mughal harem was like in the early days of Babur and Humayun and the early days of Akbar, that somebody like me could come across this work and say, well, this is extraordinary. This is a foundation for me to build on and to show how the Mughal harem wasn't this place of, degradation for women, or just, just passing time in a luxurious manner, eating pan and smoking hookahs. There's so much more to this space. So these voices of the women, they do exist. So whenever I start a work about a particular area or person, I try to find the actual voices of the women. So even back in 2500 BCE, when we are looking at somebody like Amrapali, we do find the actual song written by her, because a record was kept by all the nuns who became followers of the Buddha. And because the followers of the Buddha were great history, gatekeepers, these records survived to our day. So we still have this song written by this amazing courtesan who then became a Buddhist monk. So, but it does take a lot of extra diligence, due diligence and work. And it is not so simple and straightforward as it might be in writing the history of a man. So when I was writing the history of somebody like Jahanara Begum, for example, in Heroines, I didn't just use written works. I used, though she has written 2 books, so that was extraordinary. I used architecture, because the fact that she built so many important buildings in Shah Jahanabad, Old Delhi today, tells me something about her ambition, tells me something about her power and the wealth that she commanded. So architecture, art history, I looked at a lot of miniature paintings, and I think that was something quite, new that was being done. And when I did that in Daughters of the Sun, and then I continued at Akbar, I used a lot of the information that we can find through the interpretation of art historians when they look at miniature paintings to embed that within the story, so you don't really only use classical source material like written works, you use many, many other sources as well. So that's a difficult question, because whenever I write about these women, they become very personal to me, and I do love all their stories. But if I were to choose 3, one would be Mirabai, the 16th century Bhakti poet, simply because her life story itself is so inspiring. It's not just her works, her songs, her padas, which are of course very beautiful and moving, but the fact that she was this young Rajput bride, marrying into an elite noble family in Rajputana, in a situation which was, where she was so entirely controlled by a very patriarchal system. So she would have married at a very young age. She would have been expected to give up her own maternal, gods and goddesses. She would have been expected to worship the Kul Devi of her marital home. She would have been expected to serve her marital family devotedly, single-mindedly, having forgotten everything of the culture of where she came from. And so this was the life that she was destined to live in Parda, within the fortress, if she was in a noble family. And despite all this, when she found that she was not able to express her creativity and her divine love for Krishna, she made this extremely, powerful and difficult choice, which was to leave her marital home. And she went out into the wilderness of India to find other like-minded devotees like herself. And then she gathered this huge following within her own lifetime. She became, a pan-Indian figure. So we know in India what sort of courage it takes. Even today, I read a report by one of the agencies some years ago, and they said a significant proportion of women even today have to ask for permission from a male member in their families before they go to the market, before they go outside somewhere. So, obviously I'm not talking about urban India, but in the smaller towns and villages. So this is something which is so striking, a woman just leaving her home, leaving the parda of her elite home and stepping out into the open world. So for me, and yet over time, of course, we have forgotten the details of her life, and she's presented to us as this immaculate widow who waits conveniently for her husband to die before she leaves with her widow's rights, and at a time of life when she is no longer sexually, if you like, a threat to the honor of her clan. So I find her actual life story very, very inspiring. The other person that I find in a different way very inspiring is Jahanara Begum, because she was a Delhi woman like myself, and she did so much in this city, and we have forgotten so much, of her ambition. So right from that, she actually wrote two books, one of which is a biography of hers, and she was a Sufi. She calls herself a Sufi princess, and she uses a lot of the symbology that the Timurids, who the Mughals are actually Timurids, descendants of Timur, and that is what they claim as their legacy. She uses a lot of the symbolism, the very potent and powerful symbolism of the Timurids, to claim for herself the same sort of power and legitimacy as her father Shah Jahan. So she considers herself no less than the emperor. She calls herself the Timurid lamp, and she says, I am a Sufi princess. And you must remember that in 16th, 17th century, the Sufis were a symbol of Timurid legitimacy, one of many such symbols. And she uses this in a very, matter-of-fact way, and says, I am, I have been blessed by the great masters, and I am this accomplished Sufi peer, and she uses all these techniques and means of enforcing what she leaves behind, because she has this ambition of being no less than somebody like Shah Jahan. And in her autobiography, she also, she refutes the fact that she is less than anybody else just because she is female. And then she goes on to build the great structures of Shah Jahanabad that we know about. She builds Chandni Chowk. She builds a huge caravanserai that many foreign travelers write about with great awe, because it's this most beautiful structure. She builds hammam, she builds the chowk itself. And yet, unfortunately, in 1857, after Delhi was retaken by the British, they razed all these structures. So we have nothing actually left today of the great structures of hers within Shah Jahanabad. But we have the record. So we know that her power and her wealth was so enormous that she was able to build these structures, which commanded so much awe and respect. So she was able to do all these things, and she had, the absolute loyalty and devotion of her father Shah Jahan. She was Pacha Begum, the most senior woman of the harem from the time of Mumtaz Mahal's death until the death of Shah Jahan. She was his Pacha Begum. And then Aurangzeb took her, despite the fact that she had supported his rival Dara Shikoh. Aurangzeb brings her back to the court, and she becomes Pacha Begum of his harem as well. So it just shows the great respect she was able to command, and what an incredible woman she must have been. And the third woman is very different. It is Hazrat Mahal, who was instrumental in the 1857 uprising. And she's extremely interesting because she comes from a very different background to somebody like Jahanara Begum. She was a concubine. She was the daughter possibly of an African slave who had been brought to India, we know from certain indices. And then she came to the attention of Wajid Ali Shah. She was a dancing girl, a nautch girl, and then she was raised in within that structure. She became a pari in his pari khana, and then when she gave birth to a son, Birjis Qadir, she became a Begum. But then Wajid Ali Shah is, exiled, and he divorces all these wives of his, and she is just a divorced woman living quietly with her son when the leaders of the uprising come to her and ask her to become the symbol, of their uprising. And she takes to it with so much gusto. And when you consider her background and where she came from, that's so extraordinary. She's able to give rousing speeches. She actually leads her men into battle herself on an elephant. And so I just find the transformation of her character, the way in which when destiny came to call her, she was able to, stake her claim to immortality in this extraordinary way. This is something that I find quite amazing. Yeah, sure. So far, I first came to Akbar's story when I was writing Daughters of the Sun. So obviously, while I was writing the histories of the women of the Mughal emperors, I was naturally also looking at the men and how, they were also evolving over the 200 years of the so-called great Mughals from Babur to Aurangzeb. And I noticed an interesting trend. So as I was saying earlier, these Mughals are descendants of Timur, and they claim that legacy. And the Timurids were nomadic peoples, who traveled in the countryside. They traveled for battle, they traveled for pilgrimages, they kept traveling. They were not settled, in the way we think of it. And so their women traveled with them. There was no idea of a settled space. There was certainly no idea of a sequestered space where the women were kept, of a harem. So these women, rode alongside their men, and they had a very porous parda. They were very lightly veiled, and they were very visible in politics at the court, because there was no separation of the two things. So when Babur comes to India, he brings this same reverence for women, especially older women, the matriarchs, because they are there to give the men direction. They are there to give them political advice, military advice. And we see that very clearly through the examples of Babur and Humayun. Some of the great women of the court at that time were these elder women, Khanzada Begum, for example. And yet, when Akbar becomes king at a very young age, and through the 50 years of his reign, we slowly see that these women disappear from our chronicles. They are no longer visible to us the way in which Gulbadan makes them visible to us. We don't know their names. They are given titles which are supposedly meant to glorify them, but the title actually hides them, because then we don't even know their origins. We don't know what their name sounds like. We don't know what sort of women they were at all. They just are hidden behind this immaculate idea of Maryam Zamani, Maryam Makani. And this happens consistently in the records as well. Their names are not taken. We are not told very much about them at all. And I was wondering, about the reason for which this was happening, because Akbar at the same time was somebody who was very concerned with the lives of women, with ways in which to uplift them. So he was very troubled by the idea of sati, for example. Many of his great Rajput generals, allowed this practice themselves, and in fact encouraged it. And he was very, very troubled by this idea that women, even young women, when their husbands died, had to immolate themselves. And he physically rode out several times. Abu al-Fazl writes about this. He rides out like early in the morning when he finds out that a famous Rajput wife of one of his generals is being encouraged to commit sati. He has ridden out in the night and the early morning to try and talk to her about her children and tell her not to do this. So we see him very concerned. He raises the age of marriage for women, for girls. He tries to prohibit sati, and in many ways he does concrete things to uplift women, and yet we find that they are effaced from the records. So one of the ideas that I was thinking about was that at this time, Akbar, from a very young age, was marrying into the Rajput houses. The great houses of Rajasthan were marrying their daughters to him. This was one of the ways in which he was able to conquer this very troublesome and fractious land of Rajasthan, was by marrying their princesses. And so from a very young age, he is exposed to the ideas of parda, because, Rajasthan was practicing parda in the 16th century, because they were already fighting amongst themselves for many decades prior to the arrival of the Mughals, often fighting each other, fighting, invaders, but also other kings, their neighboring kings and chieftains. And so they had this system of polygamy, because they needed many sons. So they had married many wives. So this problem with polygamy, which arises of how to protect your women, and the Rajputs had invested a great deal of their own personal honor in the sexual chastity of their women. So this led to customs such as parda and the zenana dowry, where they were hidden behind the zenana, and then sati and johar. So one thinking is that it isn't just the Mughals who have this idea of a veil, but it is also Akbar, when he sees that his elite noblemen, the Rajput noblemen, practice this idea of parda. It is something that he aspires to. So he brings it into the zenana. Of course, at the same time, Abu al-Fazl and Akbar are also practicing this idea of a very perfect kingdom, where everything is organized and detailed, and there's no chaos, because this is a semi-divine king who is ruling this land. So within that falls the zenana, and therefore the zenana also has to be impeccably ordered and non-chaotic. And so these two factors sort of work in this manner, so that the women become completely invisible during the time of Akbar. So this was something that really interested me. I thought it would be something that I could talk about. It would be something that was worth exploring amongst the many other fascinating aspects of Akbar's life. But definitely, this was one key moment where I thought this is a 50-year period, which is crucial to Hindustan in many, many ways, but also in the ways in which we have invisibilized women. So this was why I say that I did come to Akbar first through his women. Okay, so one of the books is Ruby Lal's Noor Jahan. Now, I don't have a physical copy of it, but it's an extraordinary book. It's the same Ruby Lal who wrote Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World. So she's, a feminist historian who is very interested in bringing out the true roles of women in history. So she has written the life of Noor Jahan, which is very different from the one that has been presented to us. Because she's a historian, she's able to read all the symbology around Noor Jahan's rule, and she presents it to us in such a readable and accessible manner. So we have, this very, very accomplished historian telling us the story of Noor Jahan, telling us in a way which puts her center stage. And alongside that, if you want to read two books about Noor Jahan, you can read Parvati Sharma's Jahangir. So even though she's talking about Jahangir, she of course also talks about Noor Jahan, and she presents her to us in a very different light to the one which we normally have of Noor Jahan as this woman who somehow has, exercises this sexual power over Jahangir so that he is helpless in front of her. So Parvati instead presents this couple to us almost as a middle-aged couple who have this great entente in the way in which they want to, exercise power, the way in which this aesthetic vision that they have for the Mughal court. So these two books together you can read to find out more about Noor Jahan. And then another book that I just came across at the Jaipur Literature Festival when I was talking to a young woman scholar who has written this book called Queens of Jerusalem. And I have enjoyed it a great deal because this is a period in history that we are not very familiar with here in India, the Great Crusades and Jerusalem in the 12th century and all that was happening at that time. And it was a real eye-opener for me to realize that in this very virile world of knights and chivalry and fighting and blood and all that sort of thing, women were also able to rule. And they were not just powers behind the throne, as they often are, like they were in Mughal India as well, but they actually ruled in their own names. So it was fascinating for me to discover this world. And Catherine Pangonis writes in a really, really entertaining manner. So I would recommend that as well. And for a third book, it's not really history, it's mythology. But because we started this discussion about the role of mythology in influencing our lives even today, I really liked Madeline Miller's Circe, which is the story of the Greek goddess Circe, but seen in a very different light. And I love her writing. She writes in this very immediate manner so that you are drawn into the world of ancient Greece and this heroic age in Greece. And you even feel the climate, you feel the birds, and you know what the flowers are like. And she creates this real visceral environment that really draws you into the story. And it's a fabulously written book.